Yeah, welcome to the first session of our clinical assessment and evaluation. As you know, this is an obligatory course, so I expect all of you are here because you have to. Some of you might be here because they're actually interested in clinical psychology and may have already done some placement with our outpatient clinic or so on. So I'm going to not presuppose that. I'm going to tell you how, well, everything from start one up, but it may be that those who have done placement, they will recognize some things you've heard before. So this is called clinical assessment and evaluation, and I would like to start with a general definition of assessment. You may have had some courses on test theory and so on, but this is an important definition by Rowan and Swertlik in a student book on assessment, and says, we define psychological assessment as the gathering and integration of psychology-related data for the purpose of making a psychological evaluation that is accomplished through the use of tools such as tests, interviews, behavioral observation, and specially designed apparatuses. That's for us usually not that important. So let's unpack that a little. I think Cohen and Swertlik tried to cram everything into one definition. So the first thing is that it's about gathering and integration of psychology-related data. When you thought of assessment, usually people think of gathering it. So you get as much information as possible. But if you make an assessment, it's no use having just all these items of information. What you want is to integrate it. And that means you weigh some things as more importantly than others. So for instance, what the patient tells you might be more important than what their parents tell you, or vice versa, depends. I mean, that's your clinical judgment, so that's where integration comes in. Psychology-related data, that makes sense. I mean, you know what you need to know for assessing someone in a clinical relevant sense. And for the purpose of making an evaluation, that's also important, because what that says is that ultimately it's also some judgment from your point. I mean, before when you integrate it, you weigh the things and then you come to some judgment. Say in the clinical context, someone has a certain diagnosis or they don't. And it's not always the judgment of the patient or the patient's important others, like parents or partners. It is your judgment whether you think they fulfill the criteria for that disorder. And now, and that's the last bit, through the use of tools. So the idea isn't you just look at them and think, yeah, you kind of do more. You use standardized tools and you use interviews and so on. And we're going to go through the individual things that you have at your disposal to come to your evaluation. And yeah, sometimes there are also things with apparatuses and measurement procedures, but that's more important. Say if you make physiological assessment, then you might have some apparatus. We usually, our apparatus is tests and so on. So the functions of clinical assessment, now after you've heard that, have you got any ideas what different functions one might distinguish between? Anyone? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of clinical assessment?
Well, you have basically a diagnostics, isn't it? That you get, you kind of like, you have a problem, and you go to a doctor and he's or she's trying to assess, what you have.
So that's an important point you made. The main idea that we think of is all this assessment is there to bring you to a diagnosis in the end. Yeah. And the diagnosis is something very important in our health system, because without a diagnosis, you don't get treated. When the doctor or psychotherapist actually treats you, what they have to do is they have to give you a code, what your diagnosis is, and then they can administer treatment and be reimbursed by the health insurances, for instance. So, and also diagnosis has other purposes as well. Mostly the patients would, of course, like to know what's wrong with them. And so it's also something you communicate to the patient. You don't just write into your little thing to get your money. You actually discuss it with the patient as well. So that's one function. Any others? What else? Okay, let's just see what else there is. I think a diagnosis is one of the important things. Also what others expect of us as clinical psychologists. They think you kind of figure out what's wrong with someone. And so the first function as Cohn and Swertlik see it is the description. You make a qualitative and quantitative description of the mental disorder the person has. I mean, we're going through that in more detail soon.